Nobody in Coldwater Bend talked about the winter. Marcus Hale brought a stranger into his house the way they talked about other things men did out of desperation. When a man lost his crop to a bad summer, people brought food to his door. When he drank too much after a funeral, they looked the other way with the particular grace of people who understood that grief does not always come out clean. But when Marcus Hale rode into town on a gray November morning with the first serious snow already finding the gaps in his collar and came back that same afternoon with a woman nobody had ever seen before sitting beside him on the wagon seat, that kind of thing settled into Coldwater Bend the way a stone settles into still water. It goes down slow, but the rings keep moving long after. Her name was Clara Voss. She was 27 years old. She had been widowed in September, which was 2 months before Marcus found her, and she had spent those 2 months in the spare room of her husband's sister's house, learning what it felt like to be a problem that needed solving. She was not, by nature, a woman who took up much space. She had learned early and thoroughly how to arrange herself so that she caused the least possible inconvenience to the people around her. But there is a particular kind of not belonging that even the most self-contained person cannot make comfortable, and by the time the Reverend in the next town wrote to Reverend Aldous in Coldwater Bend about a widow needing a situation and a widower needing help through the winter, Clara had been living inside that particular discomfort long enough that a practical arrangement with a man she did not know sounded less frightening than another month of being managed. Marcus Hale was 34 years old and had been managing badly for 2 years. He would not have said that out loud. He was not a man who said things like that out loud. He was the kind of man who rose before the sun, because the animals needed tending and stayed out after dark, because there was always something else that needed doing, and came inside at the end of the day and fed his children and put them to bed and sat alone at the kitchen table for a while, in the quiet that had stopped feeling like quiet somewhere around the 6th month after Ruth died, and had started feeling like a sound he couldn't locate. Ruth Hale had been gone 2 years. She had died of fever in the autumn when the leaves were still on the trees, which meant Marcus had watched the seasons change twice since then, and each time the color coming back into the hills had felt like something he wasn't sure he had the right to notice. She had been the kind of woman who made a house feel inhabited, not through anything dramatic, through the accumulation of small things, the way she moved through a room, the particular sound of her in the kitchen before he was fully awake, the way May laughed differently when her mother was there, looser and higher, the laugh of a child who knows she is completely safe. May was 6 now. Thomas was 4. They were the reason Marcus had driven to the next town on a cold November morning and come back with Clara Voss on the seat beside him, and he wanted to be clear with himself about that. This was about the children. This was about having someone there in the mornings when he went out to the barn, and in the evenings when the dark came early and the cold came through the walls and 2 small people needed more than he could provide, while also keeping the farm from collapsing. That was what this was. He told himself this on the drive home, with the snow coming sideways and Clara sitting beside him with her hands folded in her lap and her trunk tied in the wagon bed behind them. And she had asked him only one question the entire drive. She had waited until they were clear of town, until the road had opened up into the white and gray of the fields. And then she had said, quite calmly, "How long did you have in mind?" And he had said, "Till spring. When the roads are clear and I can manage on my own again." And she had nodded once, with the air of a woman reviewing terms she had already considered and found acceptable, and she had not asked anything further. And Marcus had found this, for reasons he did not immediately examine, to be one of the more relieving conversations he had experienced in recent memory. The house was not what Clara had been prepared for. She had prepared herself on the drive for something neglected. A widower alone for 2 years with 2 small children and a farm to run did not, in her experience, have a great deal of time left over for the condition of floorboards, or whether the kitchen curtains had been washed recently. She had prepared herself to arrive and find the particular kind of disorder that accumulates when a capable person is gone, and nobody quite knows how to replace the specific way they did things. What she found instead was a house that was clean in the way of a man who had tried very hard. The floors had been swept, the dishes were stacked in the right places. The curtains were not recently washed, but they were straight. It was a house being held together by determination and not much else. And that, Clara thought, was something she understood. The children were in the kitchen when they came in. May was standing on a step stool, stirring something in a pot with the focused expression of a person who had been given a task and was taking it seriously. Thomas was sitting on the floor next to the dog, who was very large and apparently serving as a pillow. May looked up when they came in and regarded Clara with the direct and unfiltered assessment that only very young children and very old women can deliver without apology. "Are you the lady who's going to stay?" May said. "I am," Clara said. "Papa said you'd help with cooking." Among other things, May considered this. "Can you make biscuits?" "I can." Ruth made good biscuits, Thomas offered from the floor. Without looking up, there was a small silence. Marcus started to say something, and Clara said, quite easily, "Then I'll have to see if I can learn the right way to do them. You'll have to tell me if I get it wrong." Thomas looked up from the dog at that. He regarded her with 4-year-old skepticism. "Okay," he said, after a moment. And that was the beginning of that. Clara was up before Marcus the first morning. She had always been an early riser, a habit formed in childhood and reinforced by years of living with a man who expected breakfast on the table before he could be spoken to. She came downstairs in the gray dark before dawn and found the kitchen cold and the fire out, and stood for a moment taking inventory of the space the way she always took inventory of a new place, quickly and without sentiment, noting where things were and what was missing and what would need to change. She had the fire going and the coffee on by the time she heard Marcus on the stairs. She was standing at the window when he came in, watching the snow in the early light, and she heard him stop in the doorway and understood that he had expected to find the kitchen the way he had left it. She turned and said good morning in the same tone she would use with anyone, and he said good morning back, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen, with the careful courtesy of two people establishing the rules of a shared space. And it was awkward in the way of all first mornings, and also, underneath that, strangely ordinary. He thanked her for the coffee. She said it was no trouble. He went out to the barn. She woke the children. This was how the days began. May took to her by the second day. This did not surprise Clara. Children often did. She did not talk to them as though they were small adults who needed managing, which was the approach she had observed. Most people take with children they did not know what to do with. She talked to them the way she talked to anyone, attending to what they actually said rather than what she expected them to say. And children, who spend a great deal of their lives being half listened to, noticed this immediately and responded to it accordingly. Thomas took until the 4th day, which Marcus privately thought was record time for a boy who had once refused to acknowledge the existence of a perfectly decent school teacher for 3 full weeks on the grounds that she had moved his coat hook without asking. Clara did not try to win them. That was the thing Marcus noticed, in the particular way he had started noticing things about her, which was carefully and then trying to stop. She did not bring them treats or use the slightly elevated, cheerful voice that adults use when they are performing kindness for an audience. She simply showed up in their days and did what needed doing and made room for them to decide on their own schedule what they thought about her. She learned that May liked her porridge with a very small spoon because she liked it to take a long time. She learned that Thomas would only begin any activity if he had first been told what it was in full, because he did not like surprises. She learned that the dog's name was Biscuit, which explained something about the biscuit question on the first evening, and that Biscuit was allowed on the furniture, and Marcus had given up pretending otherwise. She learned these things without making a production of having learned them, and the children felt the difference. And Marcus watched it from the edges of rooms, and told himself it was simply the benefit of the arrangement working as intended. He did not know her history. That had not seemed necessary when the arrangement was being made. What he knew was that she was widowed, that she had come from 2 counties east, and that Reverend Aldous had vouched for her character with the specific warmth a man of God reserves for someone he genuinely wishes well. The practical facts. That was enough for a winter. He learned the rest in the way you learn things about a person you live with, not through conversation but through accumulation. Through the small negative spaces. She startled when a door opened too fast. Not dramatically, just a brief stillness, a gathering of herself, and then she was fine. He noticed it the first time and filed it away, and noticed it the second time and understood what it meant without needing to be told. He started knocking before he entered a room she was in, even rooms where knocking was not strictly necessary, and she noticed that too, though neither of them said anything about it. She ate carefully, as if she were not entirely sure how long the meal would last, as if finishing it too enthusiastically might cause someone to reconsider allowing it. She said I'd prefer instead of I want. She said if it's not too much trouble before asking for anything, including things that were clearly no trouble at all. She said thank you for small things with a sincerity that suggested she had learned not to take small things for granted. Marcus did not comment on any of this. He was not a man who commented on things he had observed unless commenting would be useful, and commenting on this would not be useful. What he did instead was make sure the stove was always stocked before she got up in the morning, and that the water barrel was always full, and that when she said she preferred something, that preference was simply how things were done from then on, without discussion. He did not think about why he did this. He was, in general, trying not to think too carefully about the things he was doing. December came down serious. The kind of serious that Coldwater Bend winters are known for 2 counties in each direction. Snow from the mountains in long, sweeping curtains that turned the fields white and the roads theoretical. Marcus was outside from before dawn until after dark on most days, doing the work that cold weather multiplies, and he came inside each evening to a house that was warm and fed and lit and functional in a way it had not been in 2 years. He told himself each evening that this was simply the arrangement working, that a house with another capable adult in it runs better than a house without one, that there was no more sentiment in this than in hiring a hand for harvest season. He believed this, with varying degrees of conviction, until the night in mid-December, when the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that has a sound to it, a low tightening in the walls and the window frames. And he came in from the barn at nearly 10 o'clock and found Clara still awake. She was at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and a small book open in front of her. She closed it when she heard him, quickly but not guiltily, the way a person closes something private rather than something shameful. She looked up. She had not been expecting him to be that late. "I didn't hear you," she said. "Door stuck," he said, which was true. He hung up his coat. He looked at the closed book. He poured himself coffee that had been sitting too long and sat down at the other end of the table, not immediately knowing why he sat instead of going upstairs, except that the upstairs was quiet in a way that the kitchen, with the lamp and Clara and the sound of the fire, was not. She did not appear to find his sitting unusual. She folded her hands on top of the closed book and waited, in the manner of someone who had learned that silence does not require filling. "Ruth used to write things down," he said after a while. He did not look at her. He looked at his cup. "In a book like that," she said, "it helped her think." Clara said nothing, which was exactly right. "I never read it after she died. I kept thinking I would, and then I didn't." He paused for a long moment. "I don't know if that was the right thing." Clara looked at him across the table, in the low lamplight with the sound of the cold outside the walls. "I think," she said carefully, the way she said things she had actually considered, "that some things stay private even after a person is gone. The fact that she's gone doesn't mean she stopped deserving her own interior life. She paused. So I don't think it was wrong. I think it was a kind of respect, even if it didn't feel like one. Marcus looked at her then. She was looking at her hands. I think so too, he said. I just wasn't sure anyone else would see it that way. Most people wouldn't, she said. Most people would say you should have read it, that it would have helped. And maybe they'd be right. But I don't think help is the only thing that matters. He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind moved along the side of the house with the low, serious sound it made when it meant to stay a while. What do you write? He said. If you don't mind my asking. She considered. Things I'm working out, she said. Sometimes things I can't say out loud yet. Sometimes just what happened in a day, so I can look at it from a little distance. Does it help? It tells me what I actually think, she said, which is not always the same as what I believe I think. When I'm inside of it, Marcus nodded slowly. He drank his cold coffee. The fire shifted and settled. That's a useful distinction, he said. Yes, she said. It took me a while to learn it. He went upstairs shortly after, and Clara sat at the table alone for a while with her book closed under her hands, and she wrote nothing in it that night. She simply sat. Because sometimes what you need is not to think through a thing, but simply to let it exist in the space beside you without immediately deciding what it means. January arrived, and the snow arrived with it and stayed. A week of storms that closed the roads and kept the world down to the size of the farm and the house and the small warm circle of what they had made inside the winter together. The children grew loud in the way children grow loud when they have been indoors too long, and Marcus moved through the house doing repairs that had needed doing for a year and a half, and Clara managed the days with the particular skill of a woman who knows that the management of a small household in difficult conditions is not simple work dressed up as simple, but actual work that requires actual thought, and that nobody is required to pretend otherwise. In the evenings they sat by the fire, all four of them, and the dog, who was increasingly difficult to distinguish from the furniture. May would ask Clara to read to them, and Clara would read, not in the elevated performance voice of someone reading to children, but in her regular voice, which somehow made the stories more real. Thomas would fall asleep sitting up and have to be carried, and May would last longer than she should because she was 6, and had developed opinions about bedtime. And after the children were in bed, Marcus and Clara would sit on opposite sides of the fire in the specific silence of two people who have stopped needing to fill the quiet with noise, and have not yet decided what to do about that. He was aware in January that something had shifted. He could not have said when exactly. Not the night of the long conversation in December, because it had not been sudden. It had been gradual, the way water rises, the way a season changes. One day the light is different, and you cannot say which morning it changed. You only know that it has. He was aware that he had started listening for her footstep on the stairs in the morning before he went out to the barn, though he could not have explained what he was listening for. He was aware that he saved things to tell her during the day. Small things, nothing important, and that telling them in the evenings felt like completing a circuit. He was aware that the house felt, for the first time in 2 years, like a house that had someone in it. He was aware that she would leave in the spring. He went out to the barn one morning in late January when it was cold enough that the air had a white quality to it, even without snow, and he stood in the smell of hay and horses and let himself think it clearly. The way you sometimes need to stand somewhere cold and quiet to think a thing all the way through. She has an agreement, he said to himself. She'll go when the road's clear. That is what was decided. She did not come here for anything except to get through a winter, and you knew that, and you agreed to those terms, and the terms have not changed. He stood there for a while. Biscuit had followed him out and was sitting at his feet looking up at him with the patient inquiry of a dog waiting for someone to be done with whatever this was. Right, Marcus said, to himself or to the dog, and went back to work. May got sick in February. It came fast and high the way bad fevers do, the kind that go from "she seems tired today" to "the doctor might need to come" in the space of a few hours. The doctor was in the next town, and the roads were closed. Marcus went to the barn and back twice in the span of an hour, looking at the sky and the road and calculating odds, and Clara said quietly in the doorway of May's room, "I've seen this kind of fever before. I know what to do. Let me work." She worked for 2 days. Marcus did not go to bed either night. He brought her water and fresh cloths and kept the fire and spent the hours between bringing things sitting in the chair outside May's door with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the light under it, listening to the sound of Clara moving quietly in the room, the low sound of her voice when she talked to May to keep the child from being frightened, the unhurried quality of someone who was afraid but was not going to let being afraid get in the way of what needed doing. The fever broke on the second morning before dawn. Clara came to the door and said, she asked for water and she knew my name, and Marcus stood up from the chair where he had slept 2 hours in total and put his hand briefly on Clara's shoulder and said, "Thank you," and felt, in the way he said it, that it was not sufficient, and that no word was going to be sufficient, and that she probably understood this. Clara went into the kitchen and stood at the stove for a long time, longer than it took to make what she was making, because she had held the fear down for 2 days, and it needed somewhere to go now, and the kitchen was the only place that was not the room with the child in it or the doorway where Marcus was standing. She was still standing there when she heard him come in. She did not turn around. He did not say anything either. He simply stood in the kitchen with her in the early dark, and after a while she said, "She's going to be all right." "Yes," he said, "she is." She turned then and looked at him across the kitchen. He looked older than he had in November, or maybe she could simply see him more clearly now. He looked like a man who had been afraid and was still coming down from the altitude of it. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you. I'll sit with her a while longer." He nodded. He started toward the door and then stopped. He turned back. He looked at her for a moment in the way that he had been trying not to look at her for approximately 6 weeks. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said quietly. He went upstairs. She went back to May's room, and neither of them said anything further about it, because some things exist in a space between words where words would only make them smaller. March arrived the way March arrives in mountain country, not gently, not with sudden warmth and birdsong and all the things that people who have not spent a winter in such places imagine spring to be. March arrived wet and grudging, with cold rain over the remaining snow and mud that had opinions about every step you took in it. But the roads were beginning to be passable, not easily, but passable, which was not the same thing as passable, but was close enough that the word could be used. Clara noticed it the way she had been noticing it for 2 weeks. The way a person notices a door they know they have to walk through and is not yet sure they want to. She began, slowly, the sort of ordering that precedes packing. Not packing itself, just ordering, putting things back in the specific places they had come from, which were not always the places they had ended up over the course of the winter. A quiet undoing of the small rearrangements a person makes when they begin, without meaning to live somewhere. She told herself that she was being practical, that the arrangement had been what it had been, and she had known its terms from the beginning, and she had never been a woman who allowed herself to rewrite terms after the fact simply because the situation had become more complicated than she had anticipated. She had a life to build. She had not built one in the 6 years of her marriage, which had not been a marriage that left room for that sort of thing. She needed to build one now. She needed to go somewhere and begin. She was in the small room she had been given, folding things into the trunk, on a Tuesday morning in the last week of March when she heard his step in the hallway, which she recognized the way she had come to recognize all the sounds of this house, and then the knock, and then his voice. "Can I come in?" "Yes," she said. He opened the door. He looked at the trunk. He looked at her. He looked at the trunk again. He was holding his hat, turning it slowly in his hands, which she had learned was what he did when he was working out how to say something he had decided to say. She waited. She had learned to wait for him. He was a man who needed to find the words himself. If you handed them to him, he would accept them politely, and they would never land the same way. "You don't have to go," he said. The room was very quiet. Outside, the March rain was doing its slow work on the remaining snow. "The arrangement was till spring," she said. Her voice was level. She was holding a folded cloth in both hands, and she did not set it down. "I know what the arrangement was." He was looking at her with the particular directness that he had used all winter, that quality of actually seeing what he was looking at. "I'm not talking about the arrangement." "Then what are you talking about?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain, the house settling around them. "I'm asking you," he said, "whether you want to leave." She set down the folded cloth. She looked at him. She thought about the long evenings and the lamplight and May's fever and Thomas's hand in hers every morning on the way to breakfast. She thought about the kitchen in January and what it had felt like to sit across the table from someone who said, "That's a useful distinction," to something she had said, as though what she said was worth listening to carefully. She thought about the quality of the silence between them, which was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say to each other, but the silence of two people who had so much to say they had not yet worked out where to begin. She thought about what she had come here as and what she had become over the course of one winter, which were not the same woman. "If I stayed," she said carefully, in the way she said things she had fully considered, "it would have to be on equal terms. I will not stay as something that can be reconsidered come next winter." "No," he said immediately. "That's not what I'm asking." "Tell me what you're asking." He crossed the room. He stood in front of her, close enough that she had to look up slightly to look at him, and he held her gaze with the steadiness of a man who has spent a winter making up his mind and is finished negotiating with himself. "I'm asking you to stay," he said, "because this house is yours as much as it is mine, because my children call for you at night when they have bad dreams, because I don't know when that changed from an arrangement to a fact, but it has changed and I am not interested in pretending otherwise anymore." He stopped. He looked at her. "And because I have not felt like a person who is fully alive in 2 years, and this winter I have." Clara looked at him for a long time, long enough that the rain outside changed its angle and the light in the room shifted a fraction. "That," she said, "is a good reason." She stayed. The trunk sat half-packed in the corner of the room for 3 days while they worked out what staying meant and how to do it properly, and who needed to be told, and in what order. Reverend Aldous married them on a Saturday in April, when the mud had dried enough that people could come from the neighboring farms. It was not a large wedding. Neither of them was inclined toward large. Bertha Marsh came and cried with the particular relief of a woman who has watched something take the long way around and finally arrive where it was going. The children stood in front and May held Thomas's hand to stop him from trying to pet the Reverend's hat. Walter Lawson, who was nobody's uncle, but had always behaved as though he were everyone's, told Marcus afterward that he had done well, and Marcus said he thought so too, and that was the full extent of the public sentiment. What the town took from it was the thing they always take from such stories: that some things work out, that a practical arrangement can become, in the right hands and over enough time, something neither party had thought to ask for at the outset. Coldwater Bend held this quietly, the way small towns hold the things they value, which is to say they talked about it thoroughly, and then acted as though they had never discussed it at all. By summer, Clara knew the land the way she had learned the house, not from having grown up with it, but from attention, from getting up early and paying close watch to what the morning looked like and what it meant for the day. She had been told by the world she grew up in that she was not a woman with a good mind for such things. She had believed this for a long time, the way you believe things you are told repeatedly and with authority. She stopped believing it the summer she kept the accounts for the farm and the numbers were right and the margins were better than the previous 2 years combined. And Marcus looked at the ledger and looked at her and said, simply, "How did you see that?" And she said, simply, "I looked." And he said, "Then you should be the one looking." and that was the end of the question of what Clara was capable of. Thomas stopped prefacing requests to her with "if it's okay" sometime around August. It happened gradually, and then all at once, which is how most important things happen. May taught Thomas to say good morning before he said anything else to anyone, which was a rule May had apparently decided upon and implemented without consultation, and which Clara privately thought was the best rule in the house. Marcus knocked before entering rooms. Still, always. Not out of awkwardness any longer, but out of the specific kind of consideration that comes from genuinely not wanting to surprise the person on the other side of the door. Clara had stopped startling when doors opened. She had not noticed when that stopped. She noticed only that it had. She still wrote in the small book most evenings. Marcus still sat at the other end of the table some nights and read or worked on the accounts. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they did not. The silence between them had the quality of something that had been carefully tended and had grown into something larger than what had been planted, which is the best kind of silence. Their first child was born in the spring, 2 years after the winter of the arrangement, a girl. They named her Ruth, which was Clara's idea, and when she told Marcus what she was thinking, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said yes. And that was all that needed to be said about it. May, who was 8 by then and had significant opinions about most things, declared that Ruth was the best baby she had ever personally seen, which was generous given that Ruth spent the majority of her first weeks looking either confused or displeased. Thomas was more reserved in his assessment, but was observed on multiple occasions sitting next to the cradle and talking to Ruth in a low, serious voice, apparently explaining the world to her, which Clara thought was exactly the right approach. Walter Lawson, who was nobody's grandfather but came to be known as such, held the baby on the afternoon of her second week and looked at Clara over the top of the child's head and said, "I didn't know what the winter was going to be when Aldous wrote to me. I just knew you both needed something." And Clara said it turned out to be the same thing, and he said yes. That's the luck of it when it comes, on cold evenings, when the snow came off the mountains in long familiar sweeps and the light died early and the house pulled itself in around the fire. Clara would sometimes sit with the small book and write, and Marcus would sit at the other end of the table, and the children would be in bed, and Biscuit would be on the furniture in the way of a dog who has long since won that particular argument. And the silence in the kitchen was not the silence of two strangers observing the terms of an arrangement. It was the silence of two people who had come to the same place by different roads and had found, on arrival, that they had been heading toward each other all along, not because it had been fated or arranged or inevitable, but because they had both, in the middle of a hard winter, chosen to look up from the difficult work of surviving and notice what was actually in front of them, which is, in the end, what most true things require, not destiny, just the willingness to look, and the sense, finally, to stay.